government official knocked on the door and told the mother it was for the child's own good. She never saw her son again. The file that authorized that knock was not lost, not destroyed, not hidden. It was sitting in a government archive labeled as social policy. For 60 years, there was a word the Australian government used in its official documents when describing what it was doing to Aboriginal families between 1910 and 1970. That word was assimilation. It appeared in policy memos, in government correspondence, in the annual reports of the institutions overseeing the program. It was a bureaucratic word, a clean word, a word that did not sound like what was actually happening on the ground. What was actually happening on the ground was this: government officials, police officers, and welfare workers were arriving at Aboriginal communities across Australia and removing children from their families by force, not in one state, not in one decade, across the entire country for 60 years, systematically, with government authorization, with government funding, and with government documentation that survived and is sitting in archives that anyone can request access to today. The children taken under these policies are now referred to as the stolen generations. That phrase did not come from the government. It came from a 1997 inquiry report titled Bringing Them Home, which was the first comprehensive official investigation into what had been done. The report documented testimony from survivors across Australia. It documented the policies, the institutions, the legal frameworks that made the removals possible. It documented something that the government had never publicly acknowledged in 60 years of the program's operation. The removals were not random. They were not the result of individual welfare decisions made case by case. They were the result of a deliberate, coordinated government policy whose stated objective was the absorption of Aboriginal people into the broader white Australian population. The children were the mechanism. Remove the children young enough, place them in institutions or white households, cut their connection to their families, their language, their communities, and within a generation the problem the government had identified would resolve itself. That is not an interpretation. That is what the policy documents say. The legal framework that made the removals possible was built over decades. And in the early 20th century, most Australian states had legislation granting government-appointed protectors broad authority over Aboriginal people. In some states, the chief protector of Aborigines held legal guardianship over every Aboriginal child in the state, regardless of whether that child had living parents, regardless of whether those parents had done anything that would justify removal under standard welfare criteria. The authority to remove a child did not require evidence of neglect. It did not require evidence of abuse. It required the signature of an official who had been granted the legal power to decide that removal was in the child's interest. And the definition of the child's interest was written by the same government that was administering the policy. And children removed under these policies were placed in one of two situations. Some were placed in residential institutions, government-run or church-operated facilities where they lived in group settings, received limited education, and were trained for domestic service or agricultural labor. Some were placed with white families as domestic workers, girls primarily, sent to work in households from early adolescence. The placement was not adoption in any meaningful sense. The children were not integrated into families as family members. They were placed as labor. The wages they earned, in cases where wages were recorded at all, were often managed by government accounts that the children themselves had no access to, and in many cases never received. The separation from family was not incidental to the policy. It was the point. On children who maintained contact with their families maintained their language, their identity, their connection to community. The institutions overseeing the program understood this. In documented cases, children were moved to facilities far from their home communities specifically to prevent contact. Letters sent by parents to children in institutions were intercepted. Letters sent by children to their families were not forwarded. In some documented cases, parents were told their children had been placed somewhere they could not be contacted. In some documented cases, children were told their parents had not written, that their parents did not want contact, that their families had moved on. Both statements were lies constructed and maintained by the institutions holding the children. What the Bringing Them Home report documented something that did not receive the attention it deserved when the report was published. The psychological damage documented in survivor testimony was not the result of individual instances of abuse, though abuse was also documented extensively. It was the result of the severing itself. Children who had been removed described not knowing who they were. Adults who had grown up in institutions described searching for family members for decades. Siblings removed together and placed separately described finding each other as elderly people. Parents who had had children removed described spending their entire lives trying to find out where those children had gone. In some cases, the reunions happened. In some cases, one party had already died. In some cases, the records had been destroyed or lost, or were never properly maintained to begin with, and the search produced nothing. The Australian government's response to the Bringing Them Home report was to note its findings and take no formal action on the central recommendation, which was a formal national apology. That apology did not come in 1997 when the report was published. It did not come in the years that followed, despite sustained pressure from survivors, from advocacy organizations, from members of parliament. It came in 2008, 11 years after the report, when Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stood in the Australian Parliament and issued a formal apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for the laws and policies that had caused profound grief, suffering, and loss. The apology used the word stolen, and it acknowledged what had been done. It acknowledged that it was wrong. Not one person involved in administering the policy across 60 years was ever held legally accountable for what they had done. The files that authorized those removals are still in Australian state archives. The policy documents, the removal orders, the correspondence between officials deciding the fates of children they had never met, all of it survived. The Stolen Generations registers exist today specifically because survivors and their descendants needed somewhere to record what happened and what was lost. Some of the people whose children were taken are still alive. Some of the children who were taken are still alive. The apology came in 2008. The reunions, where they happened at all, came after decades of searching. And in every case, the file that started it was sitting in an archive the whole time, labeled as social policy. If you watch this to the end, you already understand why this channel exists. The documents are real. The archives are open. The gap between what governments record and what they acknowledge is not ancient history. It is recent, it is documented, and it is still being managed. The Stolen Generations are one story inside a much larger pattern that this channel is going to keep tracing, record by record, archive by archive. If that is the kind of history you want to understand, subscribe. We are not done.